All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to eighth grade U.S. history. And what I have done for today is I've actually videotaped my lessons rather than just sharing my lessons on Zoom because I'm actually, unfortunately, not going to be in school today because I have a couple of kids who cannot go to daycare right now. So I'm going to go home and try to be a dad while teaching you all. And this was the best way that I could come up with where I could still teach everybody and then still try to be at home to take care of my kids. So, in my class, my eighth grade US history class, what I will often do days, let's say once we return to normal and start moving about our classes, is I will typically have some sort of agenda up on the board as you walk into my class every single day. And that agenda is going to look a little something like I have right here. So the agenda is just kind of what we are trying to do for today. So today we're going to look a little bit at historical thinking, and we're going to be with that. We're going to be looking at a scenario that is a lunchroom fight, as you can see right here. All right. I always put kind of the skill that we're working on for the day up on the board as well. So right now, kind of the skill that I want you to all to be able to do is become a historical thinker. And right now, there's not a whole lot of materials that you're going to need because honestly, everything's online. So, really, right now, your job for my class is to make sure that every single night you have charged your MacBook and that it is ready to go because I'm going to be putting all of my lessons up on Google Classroom. Even when I'm back in school, I think what I'm going to do is be flipping my classroom much like this, where I'll be making a video where you can kind of watch the video, and then I will also at another time I will also put up a Zoom link that'll be available to answer any sort of questions that you have. All right. So all that you need for materials right now, you should have been given your headphones already by the school, and you really just need your MacBook and Google Classroom. All right. And what we're going to be looking at today, there's really one question that I want you to be able to answer by the end of you viewing my lesson that I have given you, as well as completing the activity. And that is, what makes a credible source of information? All right. So when we talk about sources of information, here's one big thing that you all need to know about my class. In my class, I very rarely just tell you what happens in history. All right. I just don't think that's a good way for you all to learn about what happened in history. I'm not just going to tell you that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and that's what you need to remember. All right. Instead, what we do an awful lot of in my class is we look at historical sources. All right. So we look at a lot of sources throughout history. And when I talk about sources, a source is just some sort of information. This information, there's a bunch of examples up here. This a source of information might be we might watch a video of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. That right there is a source of information. That's something that happened in the past that was video recorded that we now get to watch sometime in the future. All right, so that's a source of information. We might look at interviews that people gave. We might look at newspaper articles, artifacts, all of these different things. We're going to look at different sources of information. And when we're looking at different sources of information, one of the most important things that we have to try to understand is what makes a source credible. What makes a credible source of information? All right. So essentially, we have to be able to look at a source and say, do I trust what this source is saying, or do I not trust what this source is saying? So, with that, that's kind of today's big major question. By the end of the video and activity today, I want you to be able to answer what makes a credible source of information above all else. All right. So, as you're listening to this video, that's kind of what I want you to be thinking about. And with that, I need to explain to you what exactly is a credible source of information. All right. And what a credible source of information, a credible source is essentially just a source of information that you can trust is telling the truth. All right. So it's sources that you read that you're like, you want to know what? I believe that this person knows what they're talking about on this topic. So, for example, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you are sick and you have an ear infection, here's this medicine that I want to take, that I want you to take, that's a pretty reliable a pretty credible source of information. That is a source of information that you can trust, because obviously if you go to the doctor, you're going to trust what the doctor has to say, because that doctor has taken many years of schooling, has a lot of experience in diagnosing people with ear infections. If you come up to me and say, hey, Mr. Meyer, I'm not feeling well, my ear kind of hurts, I might be able to tell you, well, I think you have an ear infection, but I'm not nearly as credible of a source as a doctor because I don't have that experience. All right, here is the scenario that you all are going to be dealing with today. All right, I want you to imagine that you are the principal of a school. All right. And I just kind of made up a date here. Let's say on September 7th, 2018, there was a fight in the lunchroom when you were the principal. And you are going to be looking at a list of different sources of information that all know something about this lunchroom fight. All right. So each one of these sources of information, what you have is you have a picture of the individual that is giving you information about the fight. You've got the individual's name, kind of how they gave their information. You've got a little bit of background on the individual that is speaking. And then you have a quote or some sort of information that this person actually said. So these are all the words that this person actually said. All right. And what you are going to have to do for today is you are going to have to determine which sources are credible and trustworthy if you were the principal trying to figure out who was involved in a lunchroom fight, and which sources are not. All right. So here's kind of how we're going to do this. When you are trying to determine if a source is credible, and remember, credible means trustworthy. It means you can trust that source. What you have to do to determine if a source is credible is you have to look at the background of that source. A lot of this is going to be, what's the background of this source? So you're going to have to think about, first of all, the first question you have to ask is, who created this information? All right. So who is the one that created this information? Are they an expert on the subject? We want to try to look at sources that know something about the subject that we are studying. So in this case, if you're looking at a lunchroom fight, you want to look for people that are experts at what happened at that fight. All right. You're also going to have to look at, the second question is, what type of source are they? Are they primary or secondary? I think Mrs. Stein, I'm actually certain that Mrs. Stein last year talked a little bit about what the difference between primary and secondary sources are, but I'm going to cover that here in a second. And then the last part is you want to try to figure out, when was this source created? Because if a lunchroom fight happened on September 7th, 2018, the best sources of information are going to be given around that time, because the further away you get from a moment in time, the less reliable a source becomes. It's kind of like this. If I were to ask you, what was your first day of kindergarten like? The day that you had your first day of kindergarten, you would probably be able to tell me a whole bunch about what you did that day. Now, however many years later, 6 years later, after your last, or I should say 8 years later, after your first day of kindergarten, you can't tell me much about that time. All right, so I'm just going to give you a quick example right here. Let's say that you are looking here at the lunchroom fight. You're looking at this first source of information, which is Jan Anderson. All right. And you're trying to figure out, is this person a credible source of information? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at who created this information. And if you look here, you can figure out who created this source of information by looking at this top part. You can see, hey, this is Jan Anderson. This is her personal account. All right, so Jan Anderson created this information. Are they an expert on the subject? Well, it says here that Jan's a cafeteria worker and was in the cafeteria when the fight took place. Otherwise, she doesn't know Justin and Max on a personal level. All right, so then you got to think to yourself, does that make her an expert on the fight that happened? All right, and what I would say here is, if I go right here, she's an expert on what she saw, but not necessarily an expert on Max and Justin. So she doesn't really know anything about Justin and Max, so she might be able to say, this is exactly what I saw in the fight, but she might not be able to give us much reason as to why the fight took place. All right, so that might be kind of what I explain right there. All right, so that's the first part the first kind of your answering of the first question. All right. The second part here is this. What type of source is this? Is this a primary source or is this a secondary source? Well, just a quick little refresher. A primary source is a record made by someone who has firsthand experience of the event. All right. So in this case, if somebody's a primary source, what that means is they saw the lunchroom fight happen. All right. So somebody's there, saw the lunchroom fight, they're a primary source. All right. If somebody only knows about the event because they heard it from somebody else, they're what's called a secondary source. And this is written most of the time, a secondary source is written about a primary source. So for example, this would be somebody who is not at the lunchroom fight. So if we take a look back at this scenario, we're going to look back at Jan. Jan says right here, she's a cafeteria worker and was in the cafeteria when the fight took place. Well, if she was in the cafeteria when the fight took place, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say, well, that means that she was a primary source because she saw the fight happen. All right, so that's that part right there. The next part that we have, the last part, is we have to try to figure out when was this source created. All right, so typically, like I said, sources that are created right after an event takes place are more credible than sources that take a long time to be created. And if we look at this example right here, this says this is a story given to principal by Jan in the lunchroom afternoon, right after the fight took place. All right, so if the fight took place in the morning and then around lunchtime and then in the afternoon Jan gave this, that's pretty darn close to when this actually occurred. All right, so if we look here, it occurred in the afternoon after the fight. Okay, that's when she gave this piece of information. So now what we have to do is we now have to look at all of this. And this is where we have to think, because in my class, one of the most important things that you're going to do is think. And we have to think, okay, is Jan a credible source of information on the fight that happened between Justin and Max? Can we trust what Jan has to say? So we have to look back at our previous three answers and we have to say, okay, she is an expert on what she saw, but not an expert on Justin and Max. She is primary source because she saw what happened in the fight. And she did give this testimony. She did talk to the principal the afternoon right after the fight occurred. So if we look at that, we're kind of looking to say, okay, is she credible? How much can we trust what she has to say? And what I would say here is, she's a pretty credible source of information. She saw the fight happen. She gave the principal all of her thoughts on what happened pretty much immediately afterwards. And then that's everything that goes with that. So what I would say here is she's credible in the fact that she was an adult that saw the fight happen, so you can trust what she has to say. The only problem as a principal is she can't give you any sort of information on Justin and Max and why they got in the fight because she doesn't know those two. All right. So what I would say there is she's pretty credible, but not like the most credible of sources. All right, now that I've given you my little spiel, my little like video introduction, your job is now going to be getting onto this lunchroom fight sources, credibility of sources, and you are going to be filling that out. And what I have here is I'm going to give video instructions on how that works on a link that I'm going to put onto this Google Doc. All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and get onto that Google Doc, and I'll explain the rest on that page.